An old man, Calvin Reic, approaches Fort Talbot's gate, his faded military ID mocked by young guards. Unfazed, he retreats silently, clutching an envelope of unspoken promises. Private Marco Salinas, haunted by Calvin's quiet dignity, digs deeper, uncovering whispers of a heroic past. A mess hall worker recalls Calvin's bravery in a long-ago fire. As rumors swirl, a Pentagon call reveals Calvin as a classified war hero who led daring rescues. The base shifts, guilt replacing laughter. What secrets lie in Calvin's envelope? Why does he return every year? The truth will transform Fort Talbot forever. This story honors unsung heroes like Calvin Reic. Share their names and lessons below. Like and subscribe to support our channel, where we amplify voices that deserve to be heard. Let's remember the quiet strength around us. Your support keeps these stories alive. Thank you for watching. The morning sun stretched long shadows across the gravel path to Fort Talbot's gate, where the air held a sharp chill in the faint hum of a military base stirring awake. Calvin Reic, 82, moved with a measured pace, each step a quiet vow to a life defined not by years, but by burdens carried and promises kept. His brown wool coat, worn thin at the elbows, draped heavily over his slight frame, and his fedora, faded to the hue of old parchment, tilted against the breeze. In his left hand, a cane, its wood smoothed by years of steadying his weight, bore the faint outline of the Marine Corps emblem, a ghost of pride under the morning light. In his right, an envelope, its edges crisp and deliberate, held secrets he'd guarded for decades. Tucked in his wallet, behind faded photos of faces long gone and a bus pass untouched in years, was an ID card so old it seemed carved from memory. To Calvin, it wasn't just a card. It was a ledger of sacrifices, a silent tally of nights spent whispering names under November skies, of letters written to ghosts who never answered. As he neared the gate, the young guards in the booth barely looked up. Lieutenant Brian Coulter, his jaw sharp and sunglasses perched too high, lounged in his chair, scrolling his phone with the careless swagger of youth. The other guards, a trio of privates fresh from basic training, traded jokes and sipped stale coffee. Calvin's voice, low and steady like a distant engine, cut through the air. "Mornin'," he said, offering the ID with a hand that trembled only slightly. Coulter took it with 2 fingers, flipping it open like it was a curiosity, not a credential. The card's plastic was cracked, its text faded to a ghostly imprint, and the photo, a younger Calvin, eyes fierce and unyielding, belonged to another time. Coulter's lips twisted into a smirk. "What's this supposed to be?" he asked, holding it up like a flawed gem. "A military ID or a ticket to the History Museum?" Laughter erupted, sharp and careless, like breaking glass. Private Jenkins, wiry and quick to grin, elbowed another. "Bet this guy thinks he's still storming beaches." Coulter tilted the card toward the sun, squinting. "This thing's older than my dad, maybe my granddad." Calvin stood still, his face a mask of quiet resolve. He didn't flinch at the mockery, didn't let his pale blue eyes, weighted by too many winters, waver. He'd faced worse. Jungles that swallowed men whole, missions that left only nightmares, and a world that moved on without him. The laughter couldn't touch him, but it stirred something in Private Marco Salinas, standing at the booth's rear, arms crossed tightly. Marco's dark eyes traced Calvin's form, noting the square set of his shoulders, the slight tightening of his grip on the cane. There was a story in that stillness, one Marco felt but couldn't name. It echoed his grandfather, Hector Salinas, who'd fought in Korea and carried the war in his silences. Hector's stories, when they came, were heavy, each word pulled like a splinter from a wound. The loud ones, he'd said once, voice rough as gravel, never saw the real thing. Coulter dangled the ID a moment longer, then shrugged. "Sorry, sir, if you're even still a sir. This card's deader than disco. Regulations say no valid credentials, no entry. Try the military museum down the road. Might suit you better." The words dripped with condescension, and the other guards snickered, but Marco stayed silent, his jaw tight. Calvin nodded once, a small gesture that might have gone unnoticed. He took the card back, his fingers brushing the torn edge with near reverent care, and slid it into his wallet. Without a word, he turned and walked toward the tree line. The tap of his cane, and the crunch of gravel under worn leather shoes marking his retreat. The envelope stayed in his hand, unopened, its weight as heavy as the silence he left behind. To the guards it was over, a fleeting amusement. But to Marco, that silence clung like damp air, thick with something unspoken. He watched Calvin settle beneath a tree, hat in his lap, envelope on his knee like a sacred relic. Calvin didn't look back, didn't fidget. He sat as if time itself owed him patience. In the booth, laughter fizzled, but the air grew heavier. Marco's chest ached with guilt and curiosity, a sense they'd dismissed something vast. He thought of his grandfather, of Hector's dusk-lit porch vigils, hands folded like they still held a rifle. Marco hadn't asked enough questions then, and now, watching Calvin, he wondered what stories this man carried, what names he whispered when the world wasn't listening. The other guards moved on, cracking new jokes, but Marco's eyes stayed on Calvin, on the morning light tracing the lines in his face, each a map of battles and burdens. Then the phone rang, sharp and sudden, cutting through the booth's chatter. Coulter answered, his smirk fading as a voice from the Pentagon crackled through. "You just turned away Sergeant Major Calvin Reic." The words hit like a grenade, freezing the room. Marco's breath caught, his mind racing to grasp the name, the title, the weight. Coulter's face paled, sunglasses slipping as he stammered. The voice on the line didn't waver, each syllable a reprimand that needed no volume. By nightfall, the guards who'd laughed stood at attention, their postures rigid with a respect they hadn't known they owed. Calvin Reic wasn't just an old man with a faded ID. He was a legacy, etched in missions never spoken, in letters to the fallen that weighed more than any medal. The base would not forget him now. His name would linger, a reminder that some stories don't need to be shouted to be heard. In the dim light of the checkpoint booth, Private Marco Salinas stood rooted, his gaze fixed on the figure of Calvin Reic, retreating into the distance. The old man's silhouette was sharp against the morning haze, his slow, deliberate steps carrying a weight that seemed to pull at the air itself. Marco's chest tightened, a quiet ache blooming as he watched. He'd only seen his grandfather, Hector, cry once, a memory seared into him from a Memorial Day years ago. The announcer's voice had trembled as it read the name of one of Hector's fallen brothers from his unit, a name that hung in the air like a ghost. Hector's tears weren't born of sorrow, but of something deeper, a raw gratitude that someone, anyone, still remembered. Now, watching Calvin Reic, Marco felt that same weight. The man's posture, steady, unyielding, yet somehow burdened, mirrored Hector's. It was a quiet strength, the kind no medal or uniform could ever capture, forged in moments no one else could see. Calvin's brown felt hat tilted slightly as he paused under a tree, his cane resting lightly against his knee. An envelope clutched in his hand like a lifeline. Marco's throat tightened. This wasn't just another veteran. This was someone whose silence carried stories too heavy to be ignored. Without a word, Marco slipped his phone from his pocket, his fingers moving with purpose as he stepped away from the other guards. Their laughter grated against the moment, their careless jokes about the old guy with the fake ID threatening to cheapen what he felt in his gut. He didn't want their noise tainting this. Scrolling through his contacts, he tapped on his cousin's name. Luis Salinas, a civilian logistics worker at a records office in Arlington. The phone rang twice before Luis picked up, his voice warm but cautious. "Marco, what's up?" "I need a favor," Marco said, his voice low, almost a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the gravity of the moment. "A quiet one." Luis paused, the faint hum of office chatter filtering through the line. "You know that stuff's not exactly open access, man." "I know," Marco replied, his eyes flicking back to Calvin, now seated beneath the tree, his gaze distant but piercing. "But if anyone can dig something up off the books, it's you." A long exhale crackled through the phone. "All right, what's the name?" "Calvin Reic, Marine Corps. Might have served in Vietnam, maybe earlier." The line went silent for a beat, and when Luis spoke again, his tone carried a strange edge. "I'll check, but if this guy is who I think he is, you might have just seen a ghost walk through your gate." Marco hung up, his pulse steady but climbing, a quiet thrum in his veins. He didn't know what Luis meant, but the words lodged in his chest like a warning. Calvin Reic wasn't just some forgotten veteran wandering onto Fort Talbot's grounds. His silence wasn't empty, it was heavy, dense with something Marco couldn't yet name but felt compelled to uncover. Inside the mess hall, the air buzzed with the usual chaos of pre-lunch preparations. Boots clacked against the tiled floor, trays scraped along metal rails, and bursts of laughter ricocheted off the stainless steel walls. Behind the counter, Gloria Hines stirred a pot of grits with a slow, rhythmic motion, her hands moving on autopilot while her mind drifted. She was only half listening to the two young guards at the counter, their voices bright with the kind of careless humor that comes from youth and inexperience. "You should have seen his face when Coulter waved that ID back at him," one of them said, grinning wide. "Looked like he stepped out of a time machine, hat, coat, the whole deal, like he was posing for a black and white photo." The other guard chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "Yeah, man, I thought he was going to pull out a musket or something." Their laughter filled the space, but Gloria didn't join in. Her hand froze mid-stir, the wooden spoon hovering above the pot as her brow furrowed. The way they described him, the quiet man in the brown felt hat, the slow walk, the unspoken dignity, it tugged at something deep in her memory, a thread she hadn't pulled in years. She set the spoon down carefully, her movements deliberate, and turned to face them. "Did he have a cane?" she asked, her voice low, almost hesitant, as if she were afraid of the answer. The guards blinked, caught off guard by her sudden intensity. "Yeah," one of them said, scratching his jaw. "And an envelope. Guy was holding onto it like it was his last dollar." Gloria's breath caught, her fingers tightening against the edge of her apron as she wiped her hands. Her mind raced back to 1982, to the fuel depot explosion that had lit up the night sky in a roar of flame and chaos. Everyone had scattered, running for cover, their shouts swallowed by the inferno's roar. Everyone except one man. He'd walked toward the fire, his steps unhurried, his silhouette calm against the blazing heat. She could still see him, brown felt hat, steady gait, pulling three men from the flames as if the fire couldn't touch him. He hadn't said a word, hadn't waited for thanks. He'd just vanished into the night, leaving only the image of that hat burned into her memory. "That wasn't just some old man," she said now, her voice barely above a whisper. "I saw him once before, back in '82. The guards exchanged a glance, their smirks fading. "You're saying that was him?" one asked, his tone skeptical but curious. "I never got his name," Gloria admitted, her eyes distant, seeing not the mess hall but that night long ago. "But I never forgot that hat." Back at the checkpoint, Marco stood watch, his phone buzzing insistently in his pocket. Luis had promised to dig through the archives, but Marco couldn't wait. His fingers moved quickly, almost instinctively, as he snapped a photo through the booth's window. Calvin Reic sat still beneath the tree, the envelope balanced on his knee, his eyes sharp yet far away, as if seeing something beyond the base's gates. Marco uploaded the photo to the base's internal forum, his caption simple but heavy with intent. "Does anyone recognize this vet turned away this morning? Mess hall staff says he saved lives in '80. The post spread like wildfire. Within minutes, comments flooded in, each one a spark that lit up the base's quiet rhythm. "Looks familiar. My uncle mentioned someone like this. Why was he denied entry? Is this for real?" Screens glowed in break rooms, security offices, supply closets. Conversations halted mid-sentence as people leaned over their phones, their voices dropping to whispers. The question rippled through Fort Talbot like a gust of wind before a storm. Who is Calvin Reic? And more urgently, what had they just done? In the security office, the air was never still. Radios crackled with updates, keyboards clattered, and the hum of rotating shifts filled the space. But now a new energy pulsed through the room, a quiet urgency that hadn't been there before. The photo of Calvin Reic stared back from every screen, his face a silent challenge, his presence a question no one could yet answer. Marco stood at his post, his jaw tight, his mind racing. He didn't know what he'd started, but he felt it in his bones. This wasn't over. Calvin Reic wasn't just a name, he was a story, a shadow, a truth waiting to be uncovered. And Marco, like Gloria, like the others now whispering his name, was determined to find out what it meant. In the quiet confines of Fort Talbot's security booth, silence had always been an unwelcome guest, creeping in during the long, uneventful stretches between routine checks. But when the phone pierced the air with its sharp, insistent ring, the word Pentagon flashing on the caller ID like a warning flare, the room seemed to hold its breath. Private Marcos Salinas, stationed nearest the phone, felt his heart lurch in his chest, a sudden jolt of adrenaline spiking through him. His eyes flicked to the display, and for a moment he hesitated, his mind racing with the weight of what such a call could mean. Swallowing hard, he grabbed the receiver, his voice steady despite the tremor in his gut. Fort Talbot Security, Private Salinas speaking. The voice on the other end was cool, authoritative, slicing through the static with precision. This is Colonel Abigail Mercer, Department of Legacy Operations, Pentagon. I need the officer in charge of your main checkpoint, now. Salinas's throat tightened, his pulse hammering as he straightened instinctively, as if the colonel could see his posture through the line. Yes, ma'am, one moment. He turned, holding the receiver aloft like it was a live grenade, his eyes scanning the room. Coulter, it's DC. They want you on speaker. Lieutenant Brian Coulter, lounging in the adjacent locker room, had been mid-story, regaling his subordinates with a tale of his supposed battlefield heroics, his voice carrying the smug cadence of someone who enjoyed the sound of his own anecdotes. The mention of the Pentagon wiped the smirk from his face, though he sauntered into the booth with a practiced air of nonchalance. He pressed the speaker button, leaning casually against the desk. This is Lieutenant Coulter, Fort Talbot. How can I assist? His tone was light, almost flippant, as if he could charm his way through whatever this was. Colonel Mercer's voice cut through the speaker like a blade, leaving no room for levity. Lieutenant, effective immediately, you are to locate Sergeant Major Calvin Reic and treat him with full military honors and protocol. You are dealing with a man whose operational record remains classified across 3 administrations. The words landed like a thunderclap, and the room fell into a stunned hush. Coulter's face drained of color, his casual posture stiffening as the weight of her words sank in. His mind scrambled to process what he'd just heard, the smug confidence he'd worn moments ago evaporating. I wasn't aware, he stammered, his voice betraying a flicker of shame. Mercer's response was sharp, unforgiving. You weren't aware because you saw an expired ID and assumed it told you everything. That man led Operation Harrogate in 1971. He extracted 29 prisoners of war from hostile territory without a single loss. His service predates your birth, Lieutenant. His security clearance, Directive 117 Bravo, remains active indefinitely. Do you understand? Coulter nodded instinctively, then realized she couldn't see him. His voice came out quieter now, chastened. Yes, ma'am. Across the room, Salinas met his gaze, his own expression unreadable, but heavy with the weight of what they'd just learned. He'd suspected there was more to the old man sitting outside, but this was beyond anything he'd imagined. Mercer's voice pressed on, relentless. A black SUV is en route to your gate. Colonel Thomas Granger is aboard. Prepare for transfer and set up an honor corridor. You have 20 minutes. The line went dead, the silence that followed ringing louder than the phone ever had. Nobody moved, each person in the booth frozen in their own whirlwind of thoughts. Sergeant Dana McNeil, who had been quietly checking logs in the corner, broke the stillness, her voice barely above a whisper. Did she say Operation Harrogate? Salinas nodded, his own voice hushed, reverent. I told you he wasn't just anybody. Coulter stood rooted to the spot, his eyes fixed on the window, where the distant figure of Sergeant Major Calvin Reic sat beneath a tree, calm and unassuming. The old man's silhouette was framed against the early morning light, his weathered hands resting on a cane, an envelope clutched gently in his grip. Coulter's mind churned, replaying the moment he'd dismissed Reic as just another retiree with an outdated ID. Now, the colonel's orders echoed in his head like a storm rolling through a canyon, each word a reminder of his misjudgment. For the first time that day, he snapped to attention, the weight of his oversight pressing down on him like a physical force. He felt the sting of his own arrogance, the realization that he'd failed to see the man for who he truly was. Outside, the low hum of tires on gravel broke the stillness, a sound that carried the weight of an approaching reckoning. From the checkpoint booth, the guards turned their heads in unison as a sleek black military SUV rolled toward the gate with unmistakable purpose. Its tinted windows caught the rising sun, glinting like polished obsidian, and behind it trailed two more identical vehicles, moving in tight formation. They didn't slow for the gate, didn't pause to request clearance. They were the clearance, their presence a command in itself. The lead vehicle stopped sharply in front of the booth, and the doors opened with military precision. Out stepped Colonel Thomas Granger, his tall, broad-shouldered frame filling the space with an authority that needed no introduction. His dress uniform was immaculate, the ribbons pinned to his chest gleaming in the morning light, his face set in an expression of unyielding resolve. Two officers followed close behind, their steps quick and purposeful, their faces mirroring Granger's intensity. Without a word, Granger strode toward the booth, his presence sending a ripple through the guards like a cold wind sweeping across a field of tall grass. Salinas felt his breath catch, a mix of awe and apprehension tightening his chest. McNeil, standing nearby, gripped her clipboard a little tighter, her eyes wide as she watched the scene unfold. Granger stopped just inside the booth, his gaze sweeping the room before settling on Coulter. "Where is Sergeant Major Reic?" His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that demanded an answer, each syllable precise and unyielding. Coulter, still pale and rigid as a statue, pointed toward the tree in the distance. "He's still there, sir, on the bench." Granger gave a single curt nod, then turned to his aides. "Begin honors protocol. Full corridor. I want salutes from the gate to the memorial. Now." The officers sprang into motion, their movements swift and coordinated, as if they'd been waiting for this moment their entire careers. Granger didn't linger. He stepped out of the booth and began walking alone toward the tree, his strides measured but purposeful. As he approached, Calvin Reic slowly rose from the bench, his movements deliberate, unhurried. His cane was tucked under one arm, the envelope still held gently in his hand, its edges worn from years of careful handling. There was no surprise in his expression, no trace of confusion or impatience. If anything, his face held a quiet certainty, as if he'd known this moment was coming and all along and had simply been waiting for the world to catch up to him. His eyes, sharp despite his age, met Granger's with a steady gaze, and in that moment, it was clear that Reic carried the weight of his past with a dignity that time could not erode. Granger stopped a few feet away, his posture ramrod straight. Then, with the precision of a man who understood the gravity of the gesture, he raised his hand in a salute. Reic returned it, his own salute slow and practiced, a motion that seemed to carry the weight of decades. The two men stood there, locked in a silent exchange that spoke of respect, duty, and a shared understanding of sacrifice. Around them, the air seemed to hum with the significance of the moment, as if the very ground beneath their feet recognized the history being honored. Back at the booth, Salinas watched, his chest tight with a mix of pride and humility. He thought of the stories he'd heard about Operation Harrogate, whispered tales of a mission so daring it had become legend. And now the man who had led it sat just beyond their gate, unassuming and overlooked until this moment. McNeil, standing beside him, let out a shaky breath, her voice barely audible. "He's been here all this time, and we didn't know." Coulter said nothing, his eyes still fixed on the scene unfolding outside, his earlier arrogance replaced by a quiet resolve to make this right. For Reic, for the men and women who had served beside him, and for the legacy that had been forgotten until now. The moment Calvin Reic locked eyes with the colonel, a silent understanding passed between them, heavy with unspoken truths. Words were unnecessary. Their gaze carried the weight of years, of battles fought, and of respect hard-earned. Calvin stood tall, his weathered frame unyielding, his eyes sharp and unwavering, as if daring the colonel to see him for who he truly was. Not a myth, not a punchline, but a man who had carried the burden of honor through decades of doubt. Back at the gate, Fort Talbot buzzed with a restless energy that rippled through every corner of the base. Officers' voices cut through the morning air, sharp and urgent, barking orders that sent recruits scrambling into formation. Dress uniforms, crisp and pressed, were flung over chairbacks in a rush, while polished boots snapped to attention with a rhythm that echoed purpose. The news of Sergeant Major Calvin Reic's arrival spread like a spark in dry grass, igniting whispers in the barracks, mess halls, workshops, and administrative offices. He was here. He was real. The man they'd once dismissed as a relic, a story told over late-night beers, was no longer a shadow of rumor, but a living, breathing testament to resilience. As Calvin began his slow, deliberate walk toward the heart of Fort Talbot, the base transformed around him. The central road, usually a practical thoroughfare, became something sacred. Soldiers lined up in neat rows, their heels clicking together, hands raised in crisp salutes. Their face, a mix of awe and guilt, reflected the dawning realization of who this man was. Mechanics, their arms streaked with grease, stood rigid in their coveralls, their usual banter silenced by the gravity of the moment. A young medic, her hands still damp from scrubbing, sprinted to join the formation, her heart pounding with a mix of nervousness and reverence. Even the chaplain, clutching his worn Bible, stepped forward from a side path, his head bowed not in prayer but in quiet acknowledgement. This was no parade, no rehearsed ceremony. It was a living apology, a tribute forged not from obligation, but from a deep, overdue respect. Calvin walked at the center of it all, his presence commanding yet unassuming. Once the subject of quiet mockery, he now moved like a giant among men, his steps steady and unhurried. The corridor of soldiers seemed to form organically, as if the base itself had been waiting for this moment, for this man to claim the path that was always meant for him. From the front gate to the memorial courtyard, hundreds of service members stood shoulder to shoulder, their backs straight, their eyes fixed forward, their hands raised in salute. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows that stretched behind them like silent witnesses. Not a single soldier wavered, their stillness a testament to the weight of the moment. Calvin's pace was deliberate, each step a quiet declaration of purpose. His cane, tucked beneath one arm, went unused, a symbol of his defiance against time and frailty. In his other hand, he gripped a worn envelope, its edges frayed from years of travel, across wars, across continents, across a lifetime of sacrifice. That envelope held more than paper. It carried a promise, a duty that had outlasted the skepticism of those who now stood in his honor. As he passed the mechanics, they were the first to salute, their oil-stained hands pressed over their hearts. Some had laughed at his name just hours before, their jokes now replaced by a solemn stillness, their eyes locked on him, unblinking. The recruits followed, young and green, barely out of basic training. They didn't fully grasp the legend of Calvin Reic, but they felt the shift in the air, the rare gravity of standing in the presence of someone whose story transcended their manuals. Their spines straightened instinctively, their uncertainty giving way to awe. The chaplain, his black robe stark against the morning light, stood silently as Calvin passed. The silver cross at his neck glinted faintly, but he offered no words, only a nod and closed eyes, as if bearing witness to a moment too sacred for scripture. Cafeteria workers, janitors, and clerks emerged from doorways and side paths, their hands folded, their mouths closed, their hearts open. The base had become a living memorial, its pulse synchronized with Calvin's steady steps. Time itself seemed to slow, bending to the rhythm of his walk, as if the world understood that this was no ordinary journey. Inside the gatehouse, Private Salinas stood beside Lieutenant Coulter, both men silent as they watched Calvin's procession. Coulter's jaw was tight, his eyes tracking every step, blinking more than he'd admit as emotion welled behind his stoic facade. Salinas, younger and less guarded, leaned in and whispered, "You see it now." It wasn't a question. Coulter didn't respond, not because he disagreed, but because some truths are too profound for words. They demand to be felt, to be witnessed in the quiet spaces between heartbeats. Calvin's footsteps echoed against the asphalt, louder than any fanfare, more resonant than any trumpet. There were no flags waving, no music swelling, but the air thrummed with something deeper than ceremony. Respect, not born of rank or medals, but forged in the fires of sacrifice and recognized now, perhaps too late, by those who stood in its presence. The soldiers lining the corridor followed Calvin with their eyes, their gazes steady and unbroken. Not a single phone was raised to capture the moment. No one dared dilute its reverence with a snapshot. At the end of the path loomed the memorial wall, its polished surface gleaming under the sun, waiting like a sentinel. Calvin never looked back. This wasn't about him, not truly. It was their moment, their chance to remember, to atone, to bear witness to a man who had carried his duty further than most could imagine. He hadn't come to be honored. He had come to deliver something eternal, something that could never be forgotten. As Calvin reached the edge of the memorial courtyard, the air grew still, as if the wind itself held its breath. The rows of soldiers who had saluted him now stood in solemn silence, watching from a respectful distance. No commands were shouted, no words were spoken. The moment was complete in its quiet, a shared understanding that needed no voice. Before him, the memorial wall stood ready, its surface a canvas for memory, for sacrifice, for truths that endure. Calvin Reic, the man who had walked through fire and time, stood at its threshold, ready to fulfill a promise that had defined his life. The granite wall stood resolute, its surface polished to a sheen that reflected the pale morning light. Yet it was cold to the touch, unyielding as the memories it bore. Names were carved into its face, each letter etched with precision, though time had begun to soften their edges, as if trying to blur the pain they carried. Calvin Reic stood before it, his frame steady despite the years that weighed on his shoulders. His hand trembled, not from the frailty of age, but from the flood of memories that surged within him, vivid and unrelenting. For a moment he was still, his breath shallow, as if afraid to disturb the sanctity of the moment. Then, with a reverence that seemed to pull him earthward, he knelt. Not out of weakness, not from the ache in his bones, but from a deep, unspoken devotion to those whose names were forever bound to his heart. He placed an envelope at the wall's base, where a beam of sunlight bathed the stone in a golden warmth, as if the heavens themselves were reaching down to honor the fallen. His fingers lingered, tracing the grooves of the engraved letters, each one a tether to a life that still echoed loudly in his soul, louder than any history book could ever capture. As his head bowed, the world around him dissolved, and the present gave way to the past. The jungle of Vietnam, 1968, closed in around him, thick with the acrid stench of smoke and the suffocating weight of fear. His squad was pinned down, the air alive with the crack of gunfire and the distant thud of mortars. The medevac had been called off, leaving them stranded in a ravine that felt like the edge of the world. Private Dorsey's voice trembled beside him, whispering the Lord's Prayer, his sleeves soaked with blood that darkened the earth beneath him. Calvin's heart pounded, not with panic, but with a fierce resolve that cut through the chaos like a blade. "Nobody dies here today," he declared, his voice steady, a lifeline for the men who clung to his every word. "Not on my watch." With nothing but a sidearm and a promise burning in his chest, he hoisted 2 wounded soldiers, one slung across his back, the other cradled in his arms, and carried them through the hail of mortar fire. Each step was a defiance of death, each breath a vow to bring them home. The memory shifted, pulling him to Cambodia, 1970, where a night mission unraveled under a relentless downpour. The rain fell in sheets, turning the ground to mud and obscuring the screams of a hostage operation gone terribly wrong. Sergeant Linwood's cries pierced the storm as he dangled from a frayed rope over a cliffside, his body battered by the elements, his voice raw with desperation. The rest of the team froze, their hesitation a silent admission of the odds stacked against them. But Calvin didn't pause. His rifle hit the ground with a thud, and he descended the slick rock face with nothing but his bare hands, the rain stinging his eyes. Inch by agonizing inch, he pulled Linwood to safety, his voice a low, steady mantra against the howling wind. "We leave together or not at all." His muscles burned, his grip faltered, but his will held firm, forged in the crucible of brotherhood. Another memory surged forward. North Vietnam, 1972, Operation Harrogate, a rescue mission deemed impossible by those who planned it. Yet Calvin refused to let doubt take root. For 3 days he didn't sleep, his mind a whirl of coded signals, extraction plans, and final checks. He coordinated every move with a precision that bordered on obsession, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of failure. When the last helicopter lifted off, its blades slicing through the dawn, Calvin stood alone in the clearing, his boots rooted to the earth. He searched the shadows for stragglers, his heart refusing to rest until he was certain every soldier was accounted for. Not one man was lost. The weight of that victory, hard-won and fragile, stayed with him long after the chopper carried him away. Back in the present, Calvin remained on one knee, the the cool stone grounding him as the memories receded. His voice was a whisper, barely audible above the soft rustle of the breeze. These were my brothers. His hand tapped the envelope, its edges worn from years of being carried, cherished. Every year, I wrote their families. I poured out what these men did, who they were, how they lived with courage most could never fathom. He lifted his gaze, his voice growing stronger, though it trembled with the weight of decades. I never mailed the letters. I thought no one would care. Behind him, the crowd stood in reverent silence, many blinking back tears, their hearts stirred by the quiet dignity of the man before them. A voice, firm yet respectful, broke the stillness. "We did, Sergeant Major." Colonel Granger stepped forward, his head bowed in a gesture of profound respect. "We've delivered every one. Your letters reached their families. Some read them aloud each year, passing down the stories. Others keep them framed, a testament to the men you refused to let fade." Calvin's breath caught, his composure wavering for the first time. He exhaled a deep, shuddering release and closed his eyes, not in sorrow but in peace. In that moment, he felt the weight of years lift, knowing his brothers were finally home. The courtyard had nearly emptied, the base personnel returning to their duties, but the morning's gravity lingered, woven into every whispered conversation, every echoing footstep. Fort Talbot seemed to hum with the resonance of Calvin's presence, his slow, deliberate walk still reverberating in its walls. Lieutenant Brian Coulter remained rooted to the spot, his hat clutched tightly in his hands, his posture rigid, not from pride but from a gnawing sense of shame that coiled in his chest. He watched Calvin move along a side path, each step imbued with a quiet dignity that seemed untouched by the salutes, the ceremony, the weight of attention. The old man settled onto a shaded bench beneath an ancient oak, his cane resting beside him, his face calm but unreadable. Coulter took a breath, steeling himself, and approached. Calvin didn't look surprised to see the younger man standing there, his expression open, inviting. The silence stretched between them, heavy but not uncomfortable, until Coulter found his voice. It was quieter than usual, stripped of the bravado that typically colored his words. "Sergeant Major, I need to say something." Calvin said nothing, only gestured to the empty space on the bench. Coulter sat, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, knuckles white. "I was wrong," he admitted, the words tasting bitter but necessary. "I mocked you. I disrespected something I couldn't begin to understand. I treated your service like it was some relic, like it didn't matter anymore." His voice faltered, and he looked down, unable to meet Calvin's gaze. The older man studied him, his eyes holding no trace of anger, only a quiet patience that seemed to see through to the heart of Coulter's regret. Calvin's silence was not a rebuke, but an invitation to continue, and Coulter took it, his words spilling out with a raw honesty he hadn't known he possessed. "I thought I knew what sacrifice meant, what duty was, but standing here today, hearing what you did, seeing how you carry those men with you, it's humbling. I've never known that kind of loyalty, that kind of weight." He paused, his jaw tight, as if wrestling with the inadequacy of his apology. Calvin leaned back slightly, his hands resting on his knees, his expression softening. The younger man's confession stirred something in him, a memory of his own youth, his own moments of arrogance, tempered by the crucible of war and loss. The bench creaked faintly beneath them, the oak's branches swaying gently overhead as the two men sat together. Their silence now a bridge between past and present, between lessons learned and those still to come. The weight of the moment pressed against Lieutenant Coulter's chest, a heaviness that wasn't born of exhaustion, but of a raw, piercing clarity that comes only after a fall. Sergeant Major Calvin's voice, steady and unyielding, cut through the air like a blade tempered by years of quiet wisdom. "You didn't let me down, Lieutenant," he said, his words deliberate, each one landing with the force of truth. "You let yourself down." Coulter's jaw tightened, a faint flinch betraying the sting of those words. He nodded, though, because deep down he knew Calvin was right. The older man's gaze didn't waver, calm but firm, like a lighthouse standing resolute against a storm. "You saw an old man with a weathered ID, and you thought that was the end of the story. But service doesn't have a shelf life, son. And respect? It's not about how many years you've clocked. It's about how you carry yourself, how you hold that truth in your bones. Coulter swallowed hard, the lump in his throat refusing to budge. His training had drilled into him how to lead with confidence, how to command a room with his voice, how to stand tall under pressure. But no one had ever taught him how to listen. Not really, not with the kind of humility that strips away pride and lays bare the soul. He felt exposed, not just to Calvin, but to himself, as if the mirror of his own shortcomings had been held up without mercy. "I've been taught to lead from the front," he admitted, his voice quieter now, almost confessional, "to speak with authority, but no one ever told me how to listen like that." Calvin's expression softened, just enough to show he understood, but his words remained unsparing. "Humility doesn't come from a manual, Lieutenant. It comes from screwing up, from staring your mistakes in the face and having the guts to let them shape you." He paused, letting the silence settle between them, heavy with meaning. Most folks spend their lives running from what they got wrong. The brave ones, they stop, turn around and let those mistakes teach them something. Coulter's shoulders slumped, not in defeat but in surrender to a truth he couldn't outrun. He thought of the moment at the gate, the dismissive glance he'd given Calvin's ID, the way he'd assumed age had dulled the man's worth. Shame coiled in his gut, but beneath it, something else stirred, a resolve, fragile but growing. "I don't want to be that kind of officer again," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. Calvin gave a small nod, not of judgment but of acknowledgement. "Then don't be." It wasn't a command or a dismissal, it was a quiet permission to start anew. They sat there for a while, the soft rustle of leaves overhead filling the silence. The breeze carried a faint chill, but it felt cleansing, like it was sweeping away the residue of Coulter's misstep. Finally, Coulter stood, straightening his uniform with care, as if the act could smooth out the wrinkles in his conscience. He met Calvin's eyes, not flinching this time. "Thank you, Sergeant Major," he said, his voice thick with gratitude. "For everything. Not just today." Calvin didn't rise. He simply held Coulter's gaze, his own eyes reflecting a lifetime of lessons learned in the quiet moments no one else saw. "Honor isn't about how loud you shout, son," he said softly. "It's about how steady you walk even when no one's watching." Coulter turned and walked away, his steps heavier than before but carrying something new. A beginning, a spark of purpose that hadn't been there before. He wasn't running from his shame anymore. He was walking towards something better. A week after Veterans Day, a new plaque gleamed at the entrance to Fort Talbot. The gate, once a checkpoint where a legend had been turned away in error, now bore a name etched in bold, burnished bronze. The Calvin Reic Gate. The inscription beneath it spoke of dignity nearly overlooked in a legacy that would endure. In smaller, more intimate lettering, a simple truth was carved. Honor endures, even when credentials expire. Every recruit who passed through that gate felt the weight of those words, a quiet reminder of humility, vigilance, and the power of truth. Over time, the story of that day faded from casual conversation, but the gate stood as a monument, transforming a moment of mockery into a place of reverence. A year later, on a crisp Veterans Day morning, a black SUV crunched along a narrow gravel road leading to a modest brick house just outside Havenwood. The trees, ablaze with autumn's fiery hues, shed their leaves in a gentle swirl, as if welcoming the visitor. Lieutenant Sarah Delgado stepped out, her boots hitting the ground with purpose. Newly assigned to Fort Talbot, she'd heard the story of the gate, whispered among soldiers like a modern parable. But she wasn't content with secondhand tales. She wanted to meet the man himself, to see the quiet strength that had reshaped a base and its people. She didn't need to knock. Calvin Reic was already on the porch, his brown felt hat tilted just so, a plain ceramic mug of coffee cradled in his hands. His eyes held the same watchful calm she'd heard described, a stillness forged not in fanfare but in the silent battles of a life well lived. "Permission to accompany you, Sergeant Major?" Sarah asked, standing tall but with a deference that came from respect, not obligation. A faint smile tugged at Calvin's lips. "Permission granted," he said, his voice warm but economical, as if he'd learned long ago that words were most powerful when used sparingly. They sat together sharing coffee and quiet thoughts as the morning unfolded. Calvin didn't say much, but his presence spoke volumes. Sarah felt it, the weight of a man who'd carried honor not as a badge, but as a way of being. Before she left, Calvin handed her a sealed envelope, her name written in precise cursive across the front. "For when the ball comes," he said, his voice steady but laced with something deeper, a knowing she couldn't yet grasp. Sarah nodded, tucking the envelope into her uniform with care, and saluted. The gesture felt inadequate, but it was all she had to offer in that moment. 6 months later, Calvin Reic passed away quietly in his sleep at the age of 80. No headlines blared his departure. No parades marked his legacy. But the news rippled through Fort Talbot like a stone dropped in still water. At his funeral, soldiers from 3 generations stood shoulder to shoulder, lining the church walls in silent tribute. Every letter he'd written, every step he'd taken, lived on in the hearts of those who had once overlooked him and now carried his lessons like a torch. Back at Calvin's modest home, Lieutenant Delgado sat alone, the envelope in her hands. She opened it with trembling fingers, unfolding a single sheet of paper covered in his careful handwriting. The words blurred as tears welled in her eyes. "If you're reading this, I've walked my final mile. Don't grieve. I was never alone. I had my brothers, I had peace, and I had the silence I chose. Remember this, you don't need a title to stand with dignity. You just need the courage to carry it when no one else will." Sarah folded the letter, her heart heavy but full. Calvin's words weren't just a farewell, they were a charge, a call to carry forward the quiet power of truth and humility. She tucked the letter away, knowing it would guide her steps, just as Calvin's steady walk had guided so many others. The wind brushed softly against the sign outside Fort Talbot, now etched with the name of Calvin Reic, a name that carried the weight of a life lived with unwavering purpose. It didn't howl with grief or wail with sorrow. Instead, it stood firm, like a sentinel honoring a legacy that refused to fade. In a world where fleeting trends and shallow judgments often drown out the quiet strength of those who came before, it's all too easy to walk past the people who laid the foundation for the lives we take for granted. Calvin Reic was one such soul, a man whose presence might have seemed unremarkable to the distracted eye, but whose story burned with a quiet fire that demanded to be seen. Calvin was the kind of man you might spot in the corner of a small-town coffee shop, his hands wrapped around a chipped mug, his eyes tracing the lines of a world that had moved on without him. Or perhaps you'd see him in the grocery store, moving slowly down the aisles, his steps deliberate, as if each one carried the weight of battles fought long ago. Maybe he'd be on his front porch, watching children race by on bikes, their laughter a fleeting echo of the freedom he once fought for. To the casual observer, he was just another elderly man, his face lined with years, his clothes plain and unassuming. But beneath that quiet exterior lay a heart that had known sacrifice, courage, and an unshakable devotion to something greater than himself. At Fort Talbot, something extraordinary unfolded. Not just a moment of recognition, but a revelation that pierced through the noise of modern life. It was a mirror held up to every soldier, every civilian, every soul who had ever dismissed someone based on the surface of their story. The events that transpired there were more than a fleeting act of redemption. They were a call to pause, to look deeper, to see the humanity in those we might otherwise overlook. For Calvin, it wasn't about medals or applause. He didn't crave the spotlight or demand that his name be carved into history. What stirred in his chest was something far more profound. The hope that the brothers and sisters he fought beside, the ones who never made it home, would live on in the memories of those who remained. In today's America, where the rush of life often drowns out the voices of the elderly, Calvin's story feels like a quiet rebellion. Older adults with their wealth of experience and unspoken sacrifices are too often pushed to the margins, seen as relics of a bygone era rather than the architects of the present. They carry stories of resilience, of moments when they stood tall against impossible odds, yet so many feel invisible, their lives reduced to stereotypes of frailty or irrelevance. Calvin, with his unassuming grace, was a living reminder that respect isn't owed to titles or appearances. It's owed to the lives people have lived, the choices they've made, the burdens they've carried in silence. Imagine Calvin in his younger years, a soldier at Fort Talbot, his heart pounding as he faced the chaos of war. The fear was there, of course. How could it not be? But it was overshadowed by a fierce resolve, a promise to himself and his comrades that he would carry on no matter the cost. Each step he took in those days was a step for the flag that still flies today, for the ideals that bind a nation, for the people who would one day walk freely because of his courage. He didn't fight for glory. He fought for the man next to him, for the families waiting back home, for a future he might never see. And as the years piled on, as his hair grayed and his shoulders stooped, that same fire still burned within him, quieter now, but no less fierce. The moment at Fort Talbot when the soldiers whispered, "Yes, Sergeant Major, we remember," was more than a salute to one man. It was a recognition of every unsung hero whose sacrifices have been buried by time. It was a vow to listen, to honor, to carry forward the stories that might otherwise fade. Calvin didn't need the world to stop and stare. He didn't ask for banners or parades. What he wanted, what he earned through a lifetime of quiet dignity, was the assurance that the names of those he loved, those he lost, would not be forgotten. His humility was his strength, his silence a testament to a life lived not for himself, but for others. In a society that races forward, chasing the next big thing, Calvin's story urges us to slow down, to notice the man in the coffee shop, the woman in the grocery store, the neighbor on the porch, to ask questions, to listen without expecting a spectacle. Because the truth is, the people we pass by every day might hold within them the very reasons we stand free. They might be the ones who faced down fear, who carried the weight of a nation's hopes, who gave everything without asking for anything in return. Calvin's legacy wasn't in the titles he held or the medals he never sought. It was in the way he lived, purposefully, humbly, with a grace that didn't demand attention but commanded respect. His example challenges us to look at the world differently. Have you ever dismissed someone because of their age, their quiet demeanor, their simple clothes? Have you ever walked past a story waiting to be told, a legacy waiting to be honored? Around us there are countless lives like Calvin's, quiet, unassuming but monumental in their impact. They deserve more than our fleeting glances. They deserve our time, our questions, our gratitude. To those who have lived through wars, through hardship, through moments that shape the world we know today, you are not forgotten. Your stories, your sacrifices, your quiet strength, they matter. They are the threads that hold this nation together, the roots that keep us grounded. And to everyone else, let Calvin's life be a reminder. You don't need a title to stand tall. You don't need recognition to make a difference. All you need is the courage to keep going, to live with purpose, even when no one is watching. In the end, it's the quiet ones, the ones who carry on without fanfare, who leave the deepest mark on the world. So take a moment today to notice them, to honor them, to remember.